Take a look in your medicine cabinet. What can you tell me about your prescriptions? Are they medications you're currently taking or left over from a procedure in the past? What information did your provider have to collect in order to receive the prescription? You and I both know prescription medications can save lives. When used appropriately, they can be used to provide a better quality of life, relieve pain, stabilize blood pressure, and the list goes on. But if there wasn't a potential for abuse, we would not be here to talk about this subject. You're listening to MedBoard Pulse, a podcast by the State Medical Board of Ohio. I'm your host, Jerica Stewart, Chief of Communications. Let's talk, Ohio. Thank you for tuning into our show. If you've been following along with MedBoard Pulse, you know that our last episode introduced the topic of prescribing. Prescribing is a big topic at the medical board, and I don't think I'd be exaggerating if I said that the board votes on a disciplinary matter related to prescribing at every meeting. That's because it's an integral part of practicing medicine. Still, like the other modalities we discuss, it is a privilege, not a right, and sometimes that right is taken away. And we're doing something a little different than usual. Because prescribing issues can cover a variety of scenarios, we're going to look briefly at 3 different cases and talk through the reasons the board took action. Joining me today to walk through a few cases of prescribing violations is our Chief of Enforcement, Brandon Puckett. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned, you're an enforcement attorney, and although you're relatively new to the board, you're not new to law or to state government. Can you share a little about your background, please?
Yeah, I came to the medical board in August of 2024, just a few months ago, really. But before that, I had the privilege of representing the medical board in administrative hearings. I was at the Ohio Attorney General's office, and I was fortunate enough that I was assigned to the medical board almost exclusively as my client. So I did a lot of administrative hearings. There's a lot of appeals and other litigation that gets involved. So I came to the board with that experience. For 7 or 8 years before that, I was on different sides of criminal litigation as a prosecutor and as a Franklin County public defender in the common pleas unit as well.
So a lot of history.
Yeah.
And I imagine when you see a lot of different kinds of cases and people who come before, in this case, the board, but in the past, before a judge. I know we're glad to have you here at the medical board, and in your role, you see the ins and outs of cases involving all types of misconduct. We're going to talk through a few examples of prescribing cases that came through our doors. It's so important to understand how serious the board takes the practice of medicine. I'm going to deviate from our normal exploration. Like I said, it's important to show a variety of the fact patterns that come before the board with prescribing. So we'll be looking at 3 separate cases and how the board dealt with them. In the first case, let's call him Dr. A. He was trained in anesthesiology and moved into pain management. And I know pain management is a topic that comes up a lot when it comes to prescribing. Can you please give a quick description of pain management?
So it's a complicated area of medicine. It involves a physician trying to, someone who specializes in treating pain, often chronic pain. It's a doctor that's going to assess a patient over a period of time, sometimes many years or their whole lifetime, regulating pain, often through therapy or prescribing. Monitoring the patient is important, making sure that they're tolerating the medication. And addiction is a obvious side effect of many pain medications. So that has to be something all licensees have to be aware of.
What were the allegations against Dr. A in this particular case?
So there's always some legal verbiage, I guess. This involved a lot of standard of care issues with patients. There were standards applicable to selecting drugs that weren't followed, breaking the board's rules regarding prescriptions. Across multiple patients, there was excessive prescribing, inadequate monitoring, not documenting reasoning and progress of patients through their charts over time.
Okay. And I know in the last episode, we discussed the importance of documentation and evaluations. You mentioned both of those things, especially when dealing with controlled substances. How many patients were involved in this case against Dr. A?
There were 10 in this one.
10 patients. That's more than we've ever covered in the show before. I'm pretty sure we've had maybe 6 or 5. Yeah. And we want to make sure we have time to look at all of the cases we're talking about today, so we're not going to get into all of the patients' experiences. But can you share some information about one of these patients?
Yeah, patient 6 is worth a deep dive, and I think it's kind of exemplary of other patient care. This patient came to Dr. A's office after the patient was discharged from a prior doctor. This patient had a history of a meniscus knee tear, a lumbar disc displacement, a lot of things that, would support a history of chronic pain needing to be attended to, a lot of discomfort. But this patient was discharged from a previous doctor after submitting 3 bad urine screens. One of the urine screens was obviously sort of a fake urine screen. It was cold and cloudy, and so he was clearly trying to get away with something. And then another urine screen that he appears to have actually submitted on his own involved methamphetamines, Valium, opioids being in his system. So he was clearly an issue for a prior prescriber who discharged him and referred him to substance abuse treatment. So at the first appointment, Dr. A immediately started patient 6 on methadone and antidepressant prescriptions. He didn't even try to drug screen this patient. So he's treating this patient for a couple of months. He ends up learning that the patient's abusing alcohol. And he does a urine screen finally, and it shows that he's not taking the methadone that was prescribed to him. And he's positive for oxycodone. So he's, getting other medications somewhere else. He doesn't refer patient 6 to a psychiatrist that he was seeing to sort of coordinate care. And then when there sort of emerged a discussion between Dr. A and patient 6 about what's actually in your system, patient 6 responded with statements implying that he would kill himself or harm himself. And if he didn't get the medications that he needed, which included narcotics, he was just going to take a lot of Tylenol instead. And so that's obviously a red flag. Despite presenting harm to himself, Dr. A didn't address that. He didn't coordinate care with the patient's psychiatrists. There was no sense of alarm or wanting to get the patient the psychiatric help that he clearly needed. And that was at the last appointment that they had together. And after that appointment, we just see a handwritten note on the front of patient's chart that says that this patient passed away a few months later.
Oh, wow. So that really became very serious then.
Correct.
You mentioned methadone, and I don't think we've talked about it explicitly, even in the last episode. What is methadone, or the kind of medication the methadone is?
It can be used to treat opioid addiction, but it's an opioid itself. And in this realm, I do have to rely on my experts a lot when I'm in hearing and preparing cases. But here, there may have been ways to treat patient 6's drug issues, but the fact that Dr. A wasn't getting a baseline assessment of what was in his system with a urine screen, he just hopped into prescribing him this. And then lo and behold, a couple months later, he's not taking the methadone. It's not showing up in his urine screen. And instead, we have a different opioid. He's clearly not on an opioid avoidant path. He's not following his prescription, rather.
Yeah. And I feel like it's worth saying that not all patients are drug seeking. In this situation, it does seem like all the signs were there. But you talked about the injuries this individual had, and when we look at pain management and patients that kind of come through the doors of pain management clinics, they often have very painful either situations, injuries, post-surgery conditions, and so not everyone. I just want to make sure that's clear too for the listeners. That not everyone is going to be drug seeking. There are people who really do have very serious needs to manage the pain that they're experiencing. But it's the job of the physician to make sure that in that management, they're not then kind of slipping into addiction or becoming dependent.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for pain management physicians. People need relief, and the balance, the tightrope that has definitely been in the public eye is, looking for these red flags from individual patients and making sure that you're not doing harm. It's a difficult area to practice, I imagine.
Thank you for giving some insight into patient 6. This case was very complex. I know we've talked about, again, these 10 patients, and they had a lot of prescription regimens and a lot of details describing Dr. A's involvement. The board secured an expert in this particular case. What did he say, or what was his overarching opinion about Dr. A's behavior and treatment of his patients?
Yeah, we very much rely on experts, and we need them in cases like this to explain to everybody, including appellate judges, what the standard of care is. And I rely on it because I'm a layperson when it comes to medicine. I try to understand it as best as I can, but I really enjoy talking to our experts. This expert, he highlighted what I already have highlighted with patient 6 as being, red flags, and they should have been caught and sort of treated appropriately. He identified multiple instances where documentation is the standard of care, not documenting the risks associated with protracted opioid treatment was something that he highlighted. Not doing anything about patient 6's statements regarding self-harm. He explained what the standard of care would be there, working with other practitioners. The psychiatrist that patient 6 was seeing at the time could have been somebody else to reach out to. So our expert was very helpful in this case. And again, there were 10 patients. There was a lot to go through. It's a lot of work.
I went through the minutes from the board meeting the day that Dr. A came before the board because, of course, all of this information, the details came out in a hearing. That's where we get to, flush out the details. Yeah. The licensee gets to present their case and their side. And when I went through the minutes, I saw that the board actually had a pretty lengthy discussion about this particular case. What was the board's ultimate decision?
So for this doctor, they did impose an indefinite suspension of at least 180 days, which means he has to be out of practice for at least that amount of time. In the meantime, he had to pay a $4,500 fine and complete coursework in prescribing and other coursework. And then he had at least 3 years of probation after having his license suspension lifted.
And when we talk about suspensions, because this is actually the first case we've discussed on the podcast where someone hasn't lost their license permanently. We've only dealt with permanent revocations, but I thought it was important to look at some other examples. Yeah. But a suspension is a pretty big deal as well, right? Because it is not just stopping you from practicing, but it has some kind of domino effects. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Gosh, I imagine it affects your insurance coverage and your employment. And, if you're licensed in other states, they could take action as well, sort of reciprocally. We refer to them as bootstrapping cases because we can just take what another state's done and review the facts that they've concluded and then take our own. So if, there's a doctor in Indiana who has a suspension, the knock-on effect is, well, in Ohio, we can look at what happened over there. So there's collateral effects. Just beyond these 180 days and coursework and things like that, I'm sure this doctor went through a lot.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you giving us a picture of that particular case. So that was the first of 3 cases that we'll be discussing today. We still have a lot of details to look at in the last 2 cases, but before we do, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Have you ever wondered what type of complaints the medical board has the authority to investigate? When it comes to our licensees, we are empowered to investigate allegations of improper prescribing, violations of the minimal standards of care, ethical violations, sexual misconduct, criminal convictions, and any other violation of Ohio rules and laws. To learn more about how you can file a complaint, please visit our website, med.ohio.gov, and click the File a Complaint button on the homepage.
Welcome back. Again, today's different because we're looking at 3 examples of providers who've been disciplined for poor prescribing habits. The next case we actually have is also very interesting and covers a completely different area. As I understand it, this case with Dr. B, we'll call him, Dr. B was a general surgeon and seemed to be respected by his peers. By looking at his notice of opportunity for hearing, which of course is when the provider is notified that the board has allegations and is going to pursue discipline. For a time, he was prescribing controlled substances to a significant other and her mother. So the board has a rule about mixing those type of relationships, huh?
Yeah, there's really multiple rules that could apply. In this case, this doctor was prescribing controlled substances. So that involves Administrative Code 4731-11-08. And so, you can only really prescribe controlled substances for your family members in emergency situations. And as we'll see in this case, that wasn't the context.
How did the behavior with Dr. B begin?
So, we have patient one here who was herself a physician, and I think they just struck up a regular romantic relationship. I don't know the context of how they met, but regular, moving things along, taking things more seriously. They started living together and then planning a life, moving to Ohio together. But as they dated, after a few years, he eventually started prescribing her a couple of different substances. She had sort of persistent gallbladder issues that caused her discomfort. So again, sort of like Dr. A, Dr. B is not coming from a space where he's intending to necessarily hurt people. He's trying to alleviate pain. And in this case, it's his girlfriend. And he prescribed her Vicodin on a couple of occasions. While doing so, he never kept a patient chart. He didn't treat her like a normal patient at all. Another thing he did with patient one was she had sleep issues. I mean, she was a busy working physician. I understood she had 12-hour shifts, and at the end of the day, couldn't get to sleep. So she asked him for considering prescribing her Ambien, which he did. And he actually voiced some concerns with that she could become dependent on Ambien. But I think due to the nature of their relationship, he was sort of wearing two hats. He's the boyfriend and the doctor, and he did what his girlfriend wanted in that situation instead of what he should have done as a doctor. So he was a surgeon is another aspect to this. Is he's probably brilliant, and he had his career was taking off, but he was a surgeon, and he didn't specialize in sleep medicine. There's no sleep testing. There's no first line approaches to addressing insomnia. He just jumped straight towards giving her Ambien on her request.
It sounds somewhat innocent, like you said, like Dr. A, helping your loved ones out. But why is this behavior dangerous?
So everybody loses objectivity when this happens. In fact, as I mentioned, Dr. B didn't want to prescribe the Ambien. And again, what role is he playing when he's writing that prescription? Is he the good boyfriend or is he the doctor? So it's mixing up your romantic interest with your medical license. And in doing so, I don't think he would have treated any patient the way he treated patient one. There's no charting at all. To prescribe somebody something like Ambien, you should have a diagnosis first. There's no diagnosis made or kept anywhere. There's no charting. That creates continuity of care issues if patient one wants to go somewhere else and discuss what her prior medical treatment was like. And the patient loses objectivity too, because she's sort of leaning on her boyfriend to give her the medication she wants. It's not clear that she's going to the right doctor. She was not seeing a PCP. She was not seeing her own.
I remember seeing that. Yeah.
Right. She didn't see her own physician at all during this time frame. So she was relying on her boyfriend to, assess these things as they came up. So lots of problems.
And we have a rule that specifically addresses that, you said, right?
Right. And in these cases, controlled substances were involved. It was not emergency medicine. He made kind of an argument at the hearing that the Vicodin prescriptions were an emergency because she was in sudden pain. Nobody bought that. I mean, we know what an emergency is.
Oh, no.
Right? That's not an emergency.
I do find it interesting that these are both physicians and that neither physician had the wherewithal to say, perhaps this is not a good idea long term. There was the apprehension you mentioned, but it's interesting that they both really have a responsibility here to acknowledge good medicine.
Yeah,
poor
absolutely.
medicine.
And it seems, this is, you don't want to go through this if you're a physician. Imagine we're having a hearing here based on a personal relationship, and we ended up in this hearing asking questions because we had to. We had to ask, why was this ongoing? And it led to them discussing their conversations about whether this should be happening at all. And so they sort of knew what they were doing wasn't good medicine, but it happened anyway.
Then can you tell me, there's one other reason the board took action, or something else that's cited. Can you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah, so there wasn't just patient 1, there was patient 2, and patient 2 was patient 1's mother. So the doctor's girlfriend's mother also got a couple Vicodin prescriptions and Ambien as well. So it's almost as if she saw what her daughter was receiving from her boyfriend and thought, maybe I can get some of that too. And she had a primary care physician. She just felt less comfortable talking with the PCP, I guess, or maybe it was just easier to get it from Dr. B. But that's, there was also no charting at all for patient 2. So he wasn't treating her like a normal patient, and the standard of care can't be followed when you're not charting.
So what did the board decide to do ultimately with Dr. B in the situation?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of frank discussion at the hearing, and Dr. B was very remorseful. To his credit, he acknowledged that he was, practicing bad judgment, explained how it wouldn't happen again. And the board weighed that, I think, and the ultimate decision was to reprimand him, give him a minimum of a 1-year probationary term. And he had to complete coursework in prescribing and record keeping. And he successfully did that. He did not have any subsequent discipline. So probably lesson learned.
That's, I guess as good of an ending as you can have. There is still discipline that's on his record indefinitely, but we have not seen him again before the board.
He has no other discipline. That's right.
Okay. Well, we just have one more case left to discuss today in our look at poor prescribing habits. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back after a short break, but you don't want to miss the last case.
How are you really feeling?
If you're anxious, overwhelmed, distressed, or having thoughts of suicide, Ohio's 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline can help.
When you call, text, or chat 988, you'll be connected to a trained crisis specialist who can provide guidance and help you feel heard and understood.
You are not alone. Asking for help is a sign of strength.
You matter. 988 is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for free, confidential support.
Welcome back. Today we were discussing physicians that were disciplined for their inappropriate and sometimes dangerous prescribing practices. I'm talking with our Chief of Enforcement, Brandon Puckett. Brandon, our last physician of the day, Dr. C, performed interventional spine procedures and practiced interventional pain management. Can you explain how the board got involved in this case?
Yeah, it's often the case that once a defendant holding a medical license is found guilty, law enforcement will inform us of the conviction. This case involved a federal indictment in the Southern District of Ohio. Dr. C was charged with felony conduct in the course of his medical practice, and that case pended for better part of a year. And upon him being found guilty, he entered a guilty plea, and upon that, we could take action concerning his license.
I'm not sure we've ever touched on criminal convictions in this podcast at all. Can you explain the significance to the board when we see that?
Yeah, the significance is with a criminal conviction, the essential facts in the criminal case are done and settled. I mean, if you've pled guilty to a felony, then the medical board has grounds to cite you, and that's under 4731.22b9. So it's sort of a settled issue, whether or not you did something wrong. And so we're not going to relitigate your federal indictment. There's a whole process involving, a guilty plea, a court accepting your guilty plea. The medical board will accept the documents from that criminal proceeding, and the crime is already proven. So our task is to decide what to do about it.
So that's a great way of describing it, because then, we're not, I know the board members will say sometimes, we were not relitigating this case. The facts are the facts. Sometimes people will deny or refute or have issue with whatever they pled to, which is interesting because the facts aren't up for debate anymore about what happened. It's kind of a closed case and deal. Yeah. But it's our responsibility as a board then to figure out how you should be disciplined, because now you could potentially be a risk to patients.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So what did Dr. C admit to as part of his plea?
So there was one felony count of illegal dispensing of a Schedule 2 controlled substances, and then another count of making false statements relating to healthcare matters. He committed those crimes by pre-signing prescriptions for his office staff, and they were going to complete the prescriptions and distribute them to patients and allowing them. He was also allowing patients to be seen by his staff when they weren't qualified to treat them. So that was the basis of the criminal indictment in his plea.
Can you talk about what's wrong with pre-signing blank prescriptions?
So yeah, and even in particular in this case, it can lead to dangerous drugs being dispensed without a legitimate medical purpose. In this case, there was oxycodone involved. That has street value, obviously. The diversion is high, abuse is high.
Oh, there's your defender background coming through.
Yeah. I've met more than a few people affected by it being on the streets. Yeah. So the doctor's not making a medical determination of whether it should go to a particular person. They're not observing the patient. They're not assessing the pain. They're not following many aspects of the standard of care. And so being the gatekeeper to a dangerous drug, having low-level staff take your place is the problem.
Because they could, pretty much anyone in the office could decide even dosage?
I understand that these can just be blank checks. They put their name on it and at least give some implied authority. And I think in this case, it was expressly, you can give this to patient.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. It's really not taking responsibility for your license.
I also found it interesting that Dr. C, even after his conviction and sentencing, like I mentioned earlier, had trouble admitting that he had treated his patients incorrectly. Have you seen this happen before? Yeah.
So Dr. C came into this administrative hearing and disputed the essential elements of what he already pled guilty to. I've seen that, and it's upsetting. I've seen it as an attorney general representing the medical board. He tried to do exactly what I said a moment ago you can't do. You can't relitigate the conviction. He blamed everyone that was below him for setting him up. He said that there was an upcoding issue, that the patient would have actually benefited from receiving the prescription, as if no harm, no foul. But he didn't take any responsibility or understanding that this was already a settled question of guilt. He said that he pled because he didn't want to risk going to trial because he was dissatisfied with his attorney. I've heard that a lot. I've heard that as a former defense attorney. It's upsetting, because I'm sure he was counseled. He didn't say that he had ineffective assistance of counsel. So while being represented, going through an almost year-long process of a criminal proceeding, he makes the intelligent, informed decision of whether to go to a jury trial or enter a guilty plea. And he entered the guilty plea. And I've done, unfortunately, a lot of hearings that have involved licensees getting convicted. And then it's always disappointing to hear someone say that, well, I'm not actually guilty. It's really trying to have your cake and eat it too. That's something I've said to the board a few times. So they ask for the administrative hearing. They come in front of the medical board and they explain that they did nothing wrong. And that's what Dr. C did. And it was typical. He blamed his prior defense counsel. He blamed his subordinates. It was, it's disconcerting to see from a professional.
The board obviously took issue with this whole situation. What was their final decision after reviewing the hearing examiner's recommendation and all the evidence?
Yeah, the board discussed everything up to and including permanent revocation. And as you mentioned, we didn't get there in these three cases. But there's good, deliberation from the board here. They did have a prolonged discussion, including considering that he did not help himself by how he presented himself at the administrative hearing. But they did. This is one of the lengthier suspensions I think I've seen. They gave him a 5-year suspension.
Oh, wow.
An $18,000 fine. And at least 5 years of probation. So
I've never seen a 5-year suspension.
Yeah, this is, and he probably talked himself into a bit of that. If he had just came into the hearing, and you're allowed to present mitigation. I want everyone to understand that that's actually very appreciated when a licensee comes during an administrative hearing. If they explain what's wrong, if they explain how they're not going to repeat the behavior and, other aspects of their personality, all of that's fair game. But it was the relitigating something that he pled guilty to. and blaming everybody else that I think talked himself into a worse position.
Interesting. And again, as we mentioned, there are cascading effects from that. I mean, he already, of course, was criminally convicted of a federal crime, so there are already consequences to that action. But 5 years out of practice is a long time to be able to stay relevant.
Yeah, you've got to lose a lot of your practice abilities in 5 years, I imagine. And employment has to be challenging.
I imagine. Well, these 3 examples today were very different from each other. They were truly a variety of situations and scenarios. But of course, there are so many ways prescribers can violate board rule or law and practices in a way that fails to meet the standard of care. We just kind of scratched the surface on those today. Brendan, what is your advice to Ohio prescribers to avoid violations in Ohio?
Yeah, these are different cases, but I think what you can conclude with all of them is that if you're a prescriber, you're the captain of the ship. You're the gateway between drug hitting the street or being overprescribed or being diverted or abused by somebody. And we had some examples of caring doctors here, people who didn't intend harm. Dr. A was trying to alleviate pain. Dr. B was trying to help his girlfriend. But you're responsible. And it really comes down to you making sure that the standard of care is followed and that nothing dangerous is getting out there.
What should patients and caregivers take away from this conversation?
So what patients can take away from this is, if you have a romantic partner that's prescribing, as tempting as it is, as easy as it is, it's not a good shortcut. It's not a good shortcut for your own continuity of care and being independently assessed, because you might not really be completely pleased with the care you get from your significant other. And then, gosh, you're in an awkward position. And, you should just start out going to somebody else. Patients who are struggling with chronic pain, I really feel for. And I think that really affects your state of mind and your clarity. But try to see as many care providers as you can. We saw patient 6 had also a psychiatrist. Maybe if there was more continuity of care between the care providers, more things could have gotten addressed or caught earlier. And patient 6 sadly passed away. So there's a lot to be cautious about with prescribing, and that's a cautionary tale, certainly.
Prescriptions are so common. Like if you personally are not receiving a prescription, then probably someone in your household or your mother, your sister, or whoever may either rely on or just require medication for a variety of reasons. So we just want you to be informed as you are a consumer and a patient, and ask questions of your providers. You can absolutely do that if you have concerns or you hear something else in the news or whatever the case may be. Brandon, my last question for you today. What do you think is your most rewarding aspect of working for the medical board?
Yeah, you can see the variety of issues that we deal with in my enforcement division. We're always trying to strike a balance between being protective of patients and being fair with licensees. You could see here, Dr. B, he was probably just deserving of a reprimand, and that's what happened. We're here to correct behavior, and that is such a productive thing to be a part of. We work with really good people. They're very smart and experienced investigators that I love talking to. Experts, such as the expert who slogged through the 10 patients in Dr. A's case, our compliance officers and my enforcement staff. I mean, there's so much that we look at every day and that we weigh in how to proceed with cases. It's always exciting. It's always exciting.
It does. I feel like the whole exciting thing, I cannot deny that there's always something different, new, exciting, terrifying. No, I won't say that. Happening at the medical board.
Yeah.
So we are along for the ride. Thank you so much, Brandon, for being here today. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Chances are you or someone you live with receives prescription medication, if not on a regular basis from time to time. There are many competent, up-to-date prescribers that perform very thorough evaluations and meet the standard of care. But if you ever have a concern that something is slipping through the cracks, you can confidentially file a complaint with the medical board at med.ohio.gov. And if you or someone you know is struggling with substance abuse, please reach out for help. There are many resources available for you, like the Crisis Text Line or the SAMHSA National Helpline, 1-800-662-HELP, available as a free resource 24/7. You're not alone. Thank you for listening today. Thank you for listening to this episode of MedBoard Pulse from the State Medical Board. A special thanks to our guest, Brandon Puckett, Chief of Enforcement. Subscribe today to hear our episodes right away. For more information about the Medical Board, visit med.ohio.gov. You can also email questions or comments to communications@med.ohio.gov. And remember, the more you listen, the more you'll learn, the more you'll share.